Hello, and welcome to Wakefield's first virtual Pride panel on the intersection of Wakefield and LGBTQIA+ communities, how LGBTQIA+ inclusion impacts individual journeys. Thank you for having me as your host. My name is Daniela Nedbalik. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white, young blonde wearing a black shirt. This event is brought to you by Wakefield Human Rights Commission and the Wakefield Community Access Television. The recording will be posted on the HRC government page, the WCAT YouTube channel, and the HRC Facebook page. By bringing us all together, the Human Rights Commission empowers everyone to encourage each other to reach our full potential and do amazing things together. Our mission is to promote the civil and human rights of all people in Wakefield. And our goal is to reinforce positive relationships in the community and to create educational programs and events to foster a greater understanding and appreciation for diversity. These activities help communities become more harmonious, respectful, and cohesive, while striving to eliminate prejudice and intolerance, promoting mutual respect and human rights, and to accept individual differences, because it is of our differences that make us so unique. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone who submitted your questions in advance. This evening, we will hear our panelists introduce themselves. Then I will be interviewing our guests, and we invite you to submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A, as we will end with questions from the live audience. To support the discussions over the next hour, I'm going to drop a graphic in the chat right now. Please see this breakdown of our community's acronym. Like gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, these terms and definitions are a spectrum. People adopt and use labels fluidly, and while culture is ever evolving, people are too, and their understanding of themselves can change. This can be found on the Facebook event page, but we will post this later on elsewhere. So, who am I and why am I here? I serve as the Secretary and Treasurer on the Human Rights Commission, which I am going on to my second year of. I've been living in Wakefield as a first-time homeowner for 3+ years now, and I'm a member of the queer community. But enough about me. Let us welcome our panelists. Camilla, Jamie, Tanya, and Sylvia, please turn on your camera and introduce yourselves to our lovely and supportive audience. Camilla, take the stage.
Hi, everyone. I'm Camilla. I'm 26 and I use she, her pronouns. I lived in Wakefield for about 4 years now, and I identify as pansexual.
Yeah, my name is Jamie. I use they, them pronouns. I am also 26 and Camilla and I are engaged. I am a white androgynous person with like icy blue hair and a black shirt. And I've lived in Wakefield for about 4 years, as long as Camilla has, I guess. And I identify as non-binary and queer.
Sorry, I'm Tanya Neslusen. I actually don't live in Wakefield. I am the Executive Director of Mass Equality, which is a statewide LGBT advocacy organization. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Bay State Stonewall Democrats and one of the co-chairs on the LGBTQ outreach subcommittee of the Massachusetts Democratic Party. Visual description, I am not 26. I am a middle-aged, chubby, brown lesbian wearing a shirt and tie and glasses.
And I'm Sylvia. My pronouns are she and her. I am a middle-aged white person with long purple hair and a sort of pinkish reddish tank top. And I identify as queer, and I've lived here in Wakefield for about 15 years now.
Great, thank you all. Those are great intros. Also, congratulations, Camilla and Jamie, on your engagement. That's exciting. The first question that we have goes to Jamie, but anyone feel free to jump in and answer afterwards, and this goes for all the other questions as well. So Jamie, what experiences have you had as a queer person in Wakefield?
Yeah, so I wanted to say that actually in-person experiences have been pretty great in Wakefield. Like walking down the street, I don't feel scared to hold my partner's hand or like kiss or have PDA or anything like that, which is coming from, I originally am from Tennessee and I was scared of that back then. However, in Wakefield, there is, I feel like in social media, Wakefield specific social media is often a little more hostile than in real life experiences are. Whether it's the newspaper or the Facebook pages or Twitter or whatever it is, I feel like people are often more bold with their statements online than they are in person. But yeah, I've overall like in person, it's been a really great experience. And I think there are people online who are rooting for us. It's just really hard sometimes.
Yeah, and that makes sense. The internet, I'm of the generation that grew up without it and then with it, and it definitely empowered people to say things that they definitely wouldn't have said to your face, as much as they would type in there that they would. So I guess, for both you and Sylvia, how have assumptions impacted your comfort with being your authentic selves here in Wakefield? And Jamie, do you want to take that first and then Sylvia?
Yeah, I can go first. I think being a non-binary person, assumptions are something I'm really scared of, because not even scared of, just hear a lot. Being non-binary means that I personally, my interpretation of it is that I don't identify as male or female. I'm somewhere in the middle, and people don't quite comprehend that when you're out in public. A lot of times I get either ma'am or sir. I get either he or she. I never really get just like, excuse me. I always get excuse me, ma'am, or like thank you, sir, or something like that. It's never, the gender neutral part of it. So people just, I don't think it's out of malice. I think it's out of people just not knowing that there are people who identify as non-binary and want to not be gendered in public. So those assumptions of me being either a man or a woman are often, it's often hurtful sometimes, because people just keep going and keep going. But overall, I think assumptions, like, what's that saying that's like, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me? I think that's always true. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think for me, it's that because I have long hair and I dress somewhat more femme, though not full, I don't tend to do makeup and stuff like that. But I actually, honestly, generally speaking, wearing like jeans and a t-shirt, I look like most of the other moms picking up their kids at school. And so it's really easy for people to perceive me as being another straight mom picking up her girl child from school, and none of those things are true. My lived experience is very different. My child is non-binary, I'm queer, and one of the ways that manifests is, I think it's really common for people to think that coming out is a single event, right? They'll ask you, when did you come out? And the correct answer is like, when did you last come out? And it's usually like yesterday, earlier today, half a second ago when you asked me what my husband did. And so coming out is a constant process, because every new person you're meeting, you're doing that judging. What do I say? What do I reveal? How much do they need to know about my life in this moment? And I think that one of the things that, again, those assumptions puts the person who is being assumed about in the position of having to decide, do I want to just let it slide, or do I say something? Every single time. And so it's not a single thing, it's a constant thing. And I think, that's a place we have to put energy, that straight and cis people might not think of as a place that we're having to hold energy and place energy, that otherwise we might get to use for other things.
Yeah, I hear that. As much as I may post every once in a while on Instagram, for example, somehow one of my closest friends had no idea. And she was sending me educational things about the community. And I just was like, I'm queer, right? And she was like, no, I had no idea. And I'm like, there's a rainbow emoji next to my name. So I hear you on the having to come out, because sometimes I'm like, has this not come across? I mean, I know it's not like a common topic of conversation, like, hi, I'm queer, right? When you introduce yourself to your friends that you've known for years, but yeah, so I totally hear that. And assumptions, Camilla and I think have a lot of shared experiences here, but let's give Camilla the stage. Speaking of assumptions, for those who do not know, can you please explain what bi/pan erasure means?
Yeah, definitely. So first off, I'm just gonna quickly say what bisexuality and pansexuality is for maybe people that don't know what that is. So people definitely have their own nuanced definitions of this, but in the most broad sense, normally being bisexual means you're attracted to more than one gender, and being pansexual is gender is kind of not in that equation. There's a great quote from a sitcom that's pretty recent, Schitt's Creek, that says, "I like the wine, but not the label." So you're really interested in like the person, but not that gender label on it. So what bi/pan erasure is basically this idea that bisexuality and pansexuality don't exist, or that they're ignored in communities and media and all sorts of things. And this doesn't just come from outside of the queer community, it's also in the queer community. And a lot of ways this manifests is, if, let's say I'm a cis woman, if I'm dating a man, people will say that I'm straight. Or if I'm dating a woman, people will say that I'm a lesbian. But who you are dating doesn't change your sexuality necessarily like that. It also comes up a lot in media, where there'll be a lot of queer characters who date people of multiple genders, and people will label them, again, as straight when they're dating someone of the opposite gender, and as gay when they're dating someone of their same gender.
Yeah, for sure. And, it kind of just demeans like not being your authentic self, and it can be exhausting, but then to have to re-explain and defend your identity, it's tough. It goes back to the having of coming out, not just once, but every time it comes up. And it can be a really alienating feature. And just in general, it's not, like you said, outside of the community, but in the community itself. You're not gay enough, you're not straight enough, you're not, where's your place? And everyone is questioning. It's just a little bit on the tough side. But Camilla, what do you think would make the experience more positive for you to be your authentic self?
Sure. So there are kind of like three main things I came up with for this, and they don't just apply to this idea of bi/pan erasure, but they definitely apply to everybody in the community. And the first one is that we need to listen to people when they tell us who they are. So that means that if someone looks like a woman, but they tell you that they're non-binary, they're non-binary. Someone tells you that they're bisexual, but they've only dated people of the opposite gender, they're still bisexual. And the second thing I came up with is we have to be careful with the words that we use. This kind of goes back to what Jamie was saying about assumptions, that it's important that we know that our words have power, and that we address people in these more neutral ways instead of assuming what they are. And if somebody is bisexual or pansexual, that we call them that, and we don't just say what we think they are in that moment. And the last thing I came up with is that we have to make room for everybody. So this is both for like allies who are kind of need to take up some responsibility of making safe spaces so that people feel like they can be their true selves. So you don't, if you're bisexual, you can talk about your relationships that are not just with the opposite sex. And this also goes for people in the community who can kind of make more inclusive spaces that where people don't feel like they have to be gay enough to be part of those spaces.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you for that. Now I want to take it to Tanya. What challenges do you find being queer in the Massachusetts community?
Well, the first thing is, quite frankly, for me personally, the pervasiveness of the word queer, because that's not how I identify or how I'm comfortable identifying, but because that's become the typical nomenclature for the LGBTQ umbrella, which I understand and respect for those who want to identify that way, it is difficult for me, having to, kind of be placed in that bucket. More broadly, personally, it's knowing that, I live in Central Mass, where it's a lot more conservative. It's a lot different. We are very much not Cambridge out there. We have, I don't know about Wakefield, but I know our community page is just, it gets off the rails. And sometimes it's really jarring to see people that, you may have seen at the coffee shop in the morning who were perfectly great to you, who suddenly are posting homophobic or transphobic rants, or I think really a lot of it is the assumption that Massachusetts is this liberal playground, and this progressive sandbox. That's just not true. There are some very conservative people here. There are a lot of people who claim to be allies, but when the rubber hits the road, they're out there, often dismissing trans identities, dismissing, LGBT history or cultural lessons, and saying that it's offensive. The rejection of LGBTQ inclusive sex ed across the state is, really tough, because there's an underlying message there that anything inclusive is adult. Anything that acknowledges who we are and that we exist is something that children should not be exposed to. And we don't often talk about that in Massachusetts, because we do have some great laws on the books. We were, the first state to have full gay marriage, which is wonderful. But bottom line, it didn't stop people from having a problem with me wearing a pride t-shirt to coach my child's soccer team. And those are the very real realities. And sometimes it really feels like you're walking on eggshells. Jamie talked about feeling comfortable holding your partner's hand in public, their partner's hand in public. And, I look at that and I say, well, that's great, but are you comfortable 2 towns over? Are you comfortable in a town that you've never been in doing that? I'm certainly not comfortable in my town doing that. That's why I really look forward to going to towns where I feel that they are a little bit more accepting and a little bit more progressive, because it really is an immense sense of freedom to just completely be myself, or not have to worry about what bumper stickers are on my car and where I'm parked. So those kind of things. So, I mean, maybe I'm a little high strung, but I kind of walk on eggshells a little bit.
I don't think that's high strung at all. I mean, even for myself, we have the HRC gave out free flags last year and this year, but last year is when I grabbed mine, and I have them on my lawn, and they're only there in June. I'm even sometimes afraid of being a target for having both a No Asian Hate and a Black Lives Matter sign on my yard. We have been targeted by, we believe, a drunk driver, because they're always throwing Budweiser cans, and it's the same type of beer, the same kind of can, the same generally every few weeks. So it's like, well, if you don't like the signs, then you really won't like my flags. And so I really feel you there. And then I do want to, you did bring up a really good point about the word queer. And I do apologize for those who, one of them is our panelist. That is like nails on a chalkboard. And it's a generational thing where, it used to be, for those who don't know, it used to be a really derogatory slur. And the community, we took back that word and we said, nope, we're going to make it ours. We're going to use it this way. And we took that power away and we put it in our hands. And for those who, and we got to keep in mind, there hasn't been a whole lot of time that's passed since these rights have been put into place. And so there are a lot of people who are alive who didn't have the rights that we have today. And they definitely didn't have the treatment that is not in Cambridge, but not everywhere, like Central Mass, as Tanya pointed out. So, it's an example of how, I think Jamie and I, we spoke about this before, we both grew up in a world where queer was never a bad word. So we didn't think anything of it. In fact, when I learned English, I think, queer was just strange to me. I didn't even realize that it was the other term that it could be used for. So you do bring up a lot of good points, and we'll touch upon, I think, a little bit later on this misconception that, what are we fighting for? Don't we have the rights? We have marriage, right? Like we can do whatever. Yeah, we'll talk about that, because there is definitely a misconception there. But for right now, Jamie, I have a question for you. Are you open in the workplace? And how has LGBTQ plus inclusion impacted your individual journey? And then let's also hear afterwards from Camilla, who can speak uniquely to intersectionality that could resonate, I think, with many of our community members.
Yeah, so I guess it's two questions. Like first, I'll talk about the workplace one. So I am pretty open within my workplace. I work in in-home therapy, working with kids and families. I honestly have to do it case by case. I generally am not I don't shy away from sharing my pronouns, but if I hear word that a certain family or a certain kid is not accepting, I will immediately go back in the closet. And it's a little scary having my first intake with families sometimes, because I never know where they're going to stand on those issues. And I never know if it's okay if I mention my pronouns, because I go in there, I introduce myself, I say, my name is Jamie, I use they, them pronouns. And sometimes they never say a word about it. And sometimes I'm very scared that they are going to start throwing me out their house and saying, why is all this terrible stuff about me? To my coworkers, I am pretty open. I'm really, really fortunate to work in a pretty progressive field of social work, where my coworkers are pretty knowledgeable about people being trans and non-binary and queer. But I recognize that is not everyone's reality by any means. I could very well go 2 agencies over and have a very different experience. And I have had very different experiences in the past. I'm just talking about my current agency. In terms of inclusion, I think there has been very, very recently, past 5 years, there has been a lot more representation of queer and trans identities within the media, which has really helped a lot of people feel more okay about fully expressing themselves. I'm not saying everything is perfect. We'll get into that later, but I'm saying that, for example, Demi Lovato just came out as non-binary and uses they, them pronouns. And that was a huge thing for my mom talking to me about it. And she was like, oh, I understand that this isn't just a you thing now. It's an actual thing. Whereas before, I think my mom thought it was, oh, this is just my kid is going through a phase. Or seeing trans celebrities like Laverne Cox in Orange is the New Black was she was such a groundbreaking person as one of, in my generation, it was the first openly portrayed trans woman that I had ever seen on TV. I'm sure there have been people before her, but that was the first one I saw, and was just loved seeing that representation. I think because of that inclusion in the media, I think it's been more openly talked about. Like there have been more open debates and more just people start to know what it is, what being trans or being queer or being LGBTQ, whatever you identify as, it's been talked about more, and that's so important.
So I just wanted to talk about being queer in the workplace. So I am out at my current job, but I've not been out at past jobs I've had. And so I work in tech and I work in the defense sector. So I do have a lot of kind of older white male colleagues at some jobs who have not been as accepting. And as someone who works in tech, who is a female, who is queer, and who is young, especially in this certain industry where most people are older, it sometimes feels like there are so many things stacked against you. And sometimes when there's just one little thing stacked against you, it's a lot. But when you keep adding on more and more things, you walk around with this extra burden that other people don't have. And I just wanted to kind of bring this up because I mean, I am white, I am cis, I have a ton of privilege, but the way that intersectionality affects all of us, it weighs you down so much more. And I know in past jobs, I've always been kind of thinking about how I'm being perceived. And so much of my mental energy is being like, how are they perceiving me because I'm young? How are they perceiving me because I am a woman? Are they perceiving that I'm gay? How are they perceiving me if they know that I'm gay? And people that have less privilege, have more of those loads sitting on them. And I think I just wanted to touch upon intersectionality and how that like really does affect us, even if you think one of those things is small, having many of those things is very large.
Yeah, for sure. I think having that inclusive culture is so key to retention, to innovation, to really, I mean, you want to meet the bottom line, you need to think outside of the box, you need different mindsets, different views, different experiences behind everything. And if there is a culture of, don't bring your authentic self to work, you're not going to keep some of us who are bringing outside of the box ideas. It's also just in general, giving that sense of belonging. And belonging is one of the trending topics now in companies, I think, after the last couple of years. I mean, diversity, equity, and inclusion in itself has just boomed in the last 5 years, let alone the last 2 years. So I'm sure there are plenty of business cases that we could point to that show why it's important, inclusivity, and why it is, and how it can actually be profitable if someone really needs that to be the reason why they get into it. But I did touch upon the generational topic just recently, but let's go back into there with Jamie and Sylvia. So what do you find being a challenge in your generation as a queer person? And do you find attitudes differ in other generations? Sylvia, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like I'm sort of on a cusp. So I'm in my early 40s. So I'm on that cusp between millennial and Gen X. I'm an Xennial, I think, whatever that means. I am of that generation that started off with the internet, but then hit the internet around the same time and being an adolescent. And so I think my identity formed through, a lot of that. I was in the sort of nascent internet at sort of that time of intense identity formation, but not to the extent that younger people are. And so I think that has sort of informed my identity. For me, and I really feel this being on that sort of cusp, because I feel like many of my friends who are older than I am are much more likely to identify as lesbian, are much more likely to identify as gay. Whereas for me, those terms never quite fit right until the term queer came into normal parlance. And for me, that is actually my strongest identity. And that's sometimes an odd place to be, where I am in touch with, I am on that cusp between generations. And that can sometimes be an odd place to be, of respecting and understanding differential experience of that word, while also having it be my strongest identity. And I think there's also an interesting generational difference around. So, I am of a generation who was able to be married by the time we had a child, to do things in the sort of normative and sometimes heteronormative order. And that's really, that's an interesting thing. That's something new. And to have that experience that, and then we've got a bunch of much younger people who are really questioning all of those systems so much, and it's so wonderful to see. And I think there's that questioning has always been there. And I know that, the fight for marriage equality in many ways eclipsed fights for much more necessary day-to-day things, like the ability to be out at work and not get fired, the ability to have housing, and things like that. And so I think, I sort of was part of that generation, but I'm also extremely aware of what needs to still be done, that we are not in any way done.
Tanya, as someone who predates the internet, do you want to jump on that while that topic's still hot?
Yes. So, I mean, that actually, and I wasn't actually planning to speak to this question until you mentioned the whole impact of the internet. And I wanted to just mention this because it really impacted the ways in which we came to our identities and we came out. When I was young, I did not know that gay was a thing that I could be. I did not know that there was a possibility of being able to question my gender identity. Those were just not things in my orbit. We had no books about that in our small town library. We had no internet. I certainly wasn't going to ask my priest or my school teachers. I honestly grew up, and for the large part of my adolescence and late teens, even through my late teens, I just assumed that it was natural that objectively women were more attractive than men, and everyone must feel this way. And, technically, if you're best friends with a guy, that must be what, love is, and that must be what a relationship is supposed to be. And I did not realize for many, many years. So I think one of the impacts, I think the internet has had a huge impact on people being able to figure out their identities. It's also something where the advances in civil rights protections have made it a lot easier for people to come out earlier. Back when I was in my late teens, early 20s, one of the things I actually didn't come out until, my 30s, and in part, fully, in part because I was a single mom for most of my son's life. And I had him when I was in my 20s. And at that time, I could have been fired from my job. I could have lost custody for moral turpitude. There were a lot of barriers in place. You could lose your housing. And all of those things have happened, not just through my lifetime, but through my adult lifetime. So the way in which I interact with the world is a little bit different in that, there's a part of me that I really, love and respect that, kids are questioning these things at 11, 12, 13 years old and talking them through with their parents and their teachers in a way that just was not accessible back when I was an adolescent. You know, and it also, you know, and there's also, you know, the part of me that just really treasures all the civil rights advancements that we made, because I know I don't feel as old as I am. And I know how quickly, in the grand scheme of things, we've had these changes and these advancements. And I know how fragile they are and how quickly they can go away. And that's the thing that sometimes really scares me for the youth, because they came into the world where, you know, there were pride flags everywhere, where you could go to the regular bar and you didn't have to go to the gay bar. And with some of the backlash that we're facing, I really worry that, you know, are we prepared to handle this? Have we prepared people to handle what would happen if we have a rights backslide?
All good points. Jamie, how about you?
Yeah, so I have kind of a different experience being a younger person. Like the internet was already a thing when I grew up, and it's so interesting because I think location makes such a difference in that too. Like yes, I did grow up with the internet and I saw all these things on the internet, but I grew up in a Catholic school in a very conservative southern town, and these things were not talked about in real life. It felt like there was the internet with all these things that could be, and then there was real life, which was like I was stuck in like things that I don't know, I was just stuck. And growing up and being able to leave the South and come up here and be in kind of like my little Massachusetts like liberal bubble has been so nice at times, because sometimes I'm able to feel like, oh, okay, like I don't have to be scared anymore. But then we have these conversations and like there's so many reasons to still be scared. And I think Daniela, you were talking about this earlier about how like there's still so much more progress to be made. There's so much progress that has been made, and I'm not discounting that. But there's so much that still needs to be done. There's so many people who are losing their lives, are losing their rights, are just having terrible things done to them. And like I'm in grad school for social work right now, and talking about all the macro level, like huge community concerns, it overwhelms me sometimes because there's so much more that needs to be done. But sometimes we can get stuck in this little bubble of like, oh, well, I'm okay within my 20 feet radius of my house, so none of it matters. But it does matter, and it matters to so many more people.
Yeah, and those are three really interesting perspectives. So thank you all for sharing. It's going to get dark for a second here, but we are going to pivot to give some context of where we are today in the US. Organizations deny qualified LGBTQ plus people the ability to foster parents. 34% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual students report being bullied at school. In 2021, 54 transgender and non-binary people were fatally shot or killed by other violent means, making it the deadliest year in US history. And more than 270 anti-LGBTQ plus bills have already been introduced across 24 states this year. A devastating historic high. Tanya, how are you coping with the recent rollback of community rights in the states? And after you, let's hear from Sylvia as a parent of a non-binary child.
I think, especially in light of Friday's Supreme Court decision, it's quite frankly terrifying. When I saw the Supreme Court decision, yes, obviously I was concerned from the choice aspect, but one of the very first things that I thought of were some of the anti-trans bills that have been introduced across the country. This is denying people medical care. It is terrifying. We are founded on a principle, or at least we were supposed to have been, on the separation of church and state, and we are allowing theocrats to, really railroad some things in just to penalize our community for existing. I feel better in Massachusetts than I would elsewhere. However, that does not mean that we are safe here. It does not mean that, and the devastating effects of getting in the car, of thinking about, if some of these protections are rolled back and some of these, anti-LGBT statutes are allowed to proceed. The idea of taking a road trip with, my wife and child is terrifying, because if we get into a car accident in the wrong place, who knows what'll happen, and it's things like that where, it really does become pervasive in your daily life, where you start thinking about what do you need to do? What do you need to do to protect yourself? On a professional level, I will say it keeps me busy, but, I don't want to be busy like this. I don't want anyone, especially youth, to have to suffer and to have to risk not being able to get the medical care they need. The other thing that we have to think about too are seniors, and the number of seniors who, in light of not knowing what kind of senior living facility or nursing home they're going into, a lot of people go back in the closet in preparation for that, because we don't always have the supports in place that we need. And with all this anti-LGBTQ legislation, it seems like that is growing. And though there have been some anti-LGBT bills introduced in Massachusetts, we can be fairly confident that they won't go anywhere. However, that doesn't mean that we still didn't have to hold our breath when the conversion therapy ban was passed. And that doesn't mean that I haven't gotten calls from parents going, now I have to take my child to X state to get therapy because you banned it in this state. Because New England is a small place. The other thing that we really just need to keep an eye on is we really need to kind of go through our existing laws with the things that the federal government is going to go roll back, to make sure that a lot of the things that we, left on the books because they didn't matter, like sodomy statutes, we just went, okay, we don't have to worry about that. Now we have to nitpick through a lot of things that we didn't think we had to do. And it, I just encourage everyone, look out for yourselves. Go to your school committee. That's the biggest threat in Massachusetts right now. School committees and library boards, that local municipal level organizing. We don't worry about the state house as much as far as anti-LGBT legislation, but you would be extremely negligent to overlook the power of the school committees and library boards in your town, and make sure that you have the right folks there, because once you've controlled, with the amount of bullying that LGBT students face, with the amount of issues that they have at those vulnerable times when they're in school, if they don't have a safe place to go, they are in true physical danger.
Yeah, so as a parent of a non-binary child, even before I knew that my child was non-binary, just as a parent, as an educator, as somebody who cares about youth and has worked with youth for my entire career, the fact that the majority of those 270 anti-LGBTQ pieces of legislation around the country are aimed at children. They're aimed at stripping the rights of children to get life-saving medical care, at children to be able to play sports and go to school and play with their friends. That's literally what they're going after. And that's horrifying. One could hope that a thing we could all agree on is like kids. we're supposed to like kids. And so it's, and watching the numbers mount. I mean, it's 270 this year. It was however many hundreds last year. I mean, this is it. The numbers go up every year, but it's not new. And it's not just this year, and it was last year, and it was the year before. And sometimes the only reason these things don't pass is because some states, their legislatures are part-time and they run out of time and they just roll it over to the next year. And so watching that creep, watching people start to nitpick, well, maybe it's okay to stop this particular kind of healthcare because, well, no. The professionals are incredibly clear. This is life-saving healthcare. And letting kids play the sports on the teams they want to play on is literally life-saving. There's no question. There's no question. And so, and I'm somebody who got married before the Defense of Marriage Act was struck down. So we did the thing of going and getting our power of attorney and all of those things and our second parent adoption forms and all of those things. We have so much paperwork. So that, yeah, if we're in another state, if my kid's on a band tour in the future and my wife goes with, that we're protected. And, having to think through, like, do we have to, flying to Arizona, should we carry our paperwork? But really it's just thinking about, like, it's kids. Come on, it's kids.
Yeah, and what cuts deep, I think, is the irony that we're supposed to be the country of the free. Because it's like, free for who? White males? That's it? Because that's not what I think what we're all actually about. So sorry, that was dark. Maybe we can pivot to our last question before we go into the audience Q&A. How do you celebrate Pride? Personally, I overindulge in all the RuPaul's Drag Race. I rewatch and watch and rewatch. I do not care. I will just, yes, everything. I hope I'm getting better at makeup. They are teaching me everything I know, that and TikTok. I also have been watching Legendary, which, for those who do not know, there's a part of our culture, and it actually stems a lot from Black and Latina LGBTQ members. It's called the ballroom culture. And so basically, if you've seen Pose, it's another TV show that goes into it, or Paris is Burning, which is a really good documentary we highly recommend. But it goes into how like the dancing and the fashion and just like all about the culture. And I live for it. That, and I get really, really busy because I work on the Human Rights Commission and I'm on the subcommittee for Pride. And we had 3 events this year, and all the events, it seemed. So it seemed like I was eating, breathing Pride. And then at work, I work in DE and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I am openly out at work. So there I was also, I was the face of the campaign at work. I was on a panel. So yeah, live, eat, breathe Pride, but I rewatch RuPaul all the time. So it's not just limited to June. What do any of you do to celebrate Pride?
These days, I just work. I literally table a minimum of 2 prides every single weekend. I'm doing, I do educational talks in the evenings, and I sit on panel discussions in the evenings. And then the rest of the time is devoted to, doing the day-to-day office work and preparing for all of that stuff on the weekends and evenings. Yeah, so unfortunately, I'm a very bad gay because I literally ignore my wife and child for Pride. So
in our family, the Pride Fairy comes. We celebrate Pride pretty big in our family. So the Pride Fairy comes towards the beginning of June and brings gifts of like a t-shirt, Bombas Pride socks, a flag, this year a toy in the shape of a Stegosaurus toy in the non-binary flag colors, stuff like that. And then we just try to, go to as many Pride things as we can. We read a ton of books year round, obviously, but I love, I just all the new kids books that come out every year, more and more every year. This year's particular favorite is "'Twas the Night Before Pride" by Joanna McClintock. Highly recommended. It handles the origins in the Stonewall riots in a way that most picture books totally gloss over and ignore. So highly recommended. And buy it at Whiteland Books or Copper Dog Books, one of our local independent bookstores. But yeah, so we go hard for Pride in our family. It's definitely a celebratory month for us. And yeah. So if anyone else needs the Pride Fairy to come to your family, what's really fun is to ask your kid to draw what the Pride Fairy looks like.
Oh man, yeah. I would like to draw what I think that would be a good event for next year. How about that? All right, Pride subcommittee members, if you're on the line, just take note. What about you, Jamie and Camilla? Did you celebrate? Did you go to any of the celebrations locally?
So yeah, this year we usually go to Boston Pride, but we know what that happened with that. We actually went up to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, went to Portsmouth Pride this year. My favorite thing about Pride is I love to just going to Pride events. Just like I got top surgery 3 years ago. So I just love being shirtless like all of June and just like being like, yes, I have scars, like because I'm trans, like eat it. And so that's my favorite thing, is just not having a shirt for the entire month of June.
My favorite thing about going to like a Pride festival is seeing so many happy people, because there's so many people there that are like getting to be their authentic selves, and you can just imagine they don't get to be that on like a day-to-day basis in public, and getting to see so many people just like wear what they want, be who they want, like have pins with their correct pronouns. It makes me so happy to just see people that happy living their lives.
Yeah, it really is contagious. I went to my first Pride celebration this year in Providence, and just the vibe, it was a vibe in itself. But let's go to, we have one question from the audience, and that is anyone comfortable sharing what made them decide to be their true selves and come out? Tanya, I don't know if you want to take that, or anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, I can take that. I think for me, because I kind of did like the out and then back in, in my early 20s. And then I did I identified as bisexual, but, was always in heterosexual relationships for a good portion. But when I actually came out as a lesbian, it wasn't until I was in my 30s. And part of that was because my son, when he got to be around, 7, 8 years old, I started to realize that that being in the closet, I could not bring my full self anywhere. And as a parent, you want your child to bring all of them. You cannot look at your child and see them as anything less than a perfect being, unless you peek in their rooms, at which point you realize how very imperfect they are. But at the same time, I wanted him to celebrate every part of himself and know every part of himself. And I realized that I couldn't do that unless I was comfortable with myself. That said, he was the very first person that I came out to, because I wanted to feel him out, because he was school age and I knew we lived in a conservative town. And I said, Nick, how would you feel if I only dated girls from now on? And he said, that's fine. And I'm like, well, do you know what that means? And he goes, yeah, you're a lesbian. And I said, okay, well, do you want to talk about it? He's like, why would I want to talk about it? Unless you bring somebody home, I don't need to have a conversation with you about this. And that was as far as it went. And it kind of blew my mind because this huge thing that had been weighing on me my entire life, that had held me back from so many things. Before I came out, I tried to shy away from the spotlight. I was the person at parties who didn't talk to people. I cleaned up the house. I did not, I did not want to be particularly visible at work or in any situation because I felt like I was going to slip up and spill the secret at any moment, and it was a crushing burden. And once I released that burden, I became a better parent. I became a better worker. I became a better friend. I became a better everything. And that's what I wanted my son to see. And I guess that's why I ultimately came out.
I love that. No, I don't need to talk about it. Unless you're going to bring someone home. Well, thank you for sharing that. We are just about at time. So I want to thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to Wakefield Community Access TV and to the Pride Subcommittee of the HRC for putting this event together. And before signing off, a few takeaways in what you can do to create an inclusive culture for LGBTQ+ community. There is an infographic on the event page on Facebook that I just linked in the Zoom chat. Again, we will try to post these resources in a public setting like the government website. So that way, if you're not on social media, which totally fair, you can still access these resources. But a few of the things you could do are to include and amplify LGBTQIA+ voices. Don't make assumptions about people. And speak up when you hear anti-LGBTQ+ comments and jokes. There is something to be said about being an ally and then being someone who is active, who is an accomplice, sort of say. Accomplice sometimes has a negative connotation, but I mean, someone who sees something wrong and then doesn't do something could be an ally, but then someone who speaks up, that's an accomplice. They are actively helping. So be an accomplice. Confront your unconscious bias. We all have them. I can admit that I have them. I'm constantly trying to confront them, recognize them, unlearn them, and promote equality and treat all people, no matter what, with dignity and respect. And lastly, learn more about LGBTQ+ issues and workplace trends. Be aware of your surroundings and what's happening around you because it's impacting us all, whether you're in the community or not. But yeah, so with that, I see also that Sylvia, I don't know if you want to post that in the chat before we go away. Here, I got you. She's linking in the gender unicorn for a person who asked about gender identity and sexual orientation. So there's a www.transstudent.org/gender/ for those of you who are listening in. And with that, we're going to wish you a good evening. Thank you again, and happy Pride.
Happy Pride, everyone.